The bells came down off the hill before it was light, 40 of them and more, small and dull and steady, the sound of a herd of goats moving through wet elder in the dark. And by the time the sky over Pell Creek had gone the color of a washed pan, the line of people already ran from the yard gate down the wagon track and out along the water almost to the ford. They stood the way people stand who are not certain they have the right to be standing there. They had their hats in their hands. Some of them had come from the far end of the county, driving through the night on the frozen ruts, and every one of them carried a hide, or a bundle of hides, salted and stiff and stinking, cow and calf and horse and mule, and the whole winter's dead, the ruined wealth of a hard country brought down at last to a single flat piece of bottom land that 4 years before, no man for miles would have crossed the creek to own. Inside the yard she was counting. She stood at the head of a row of 7 stone vats sunk level with the ground, each one brimming dark with tan liquor the color of strong tea, and she went down the row with a girl at her elbow and a stub of pencil in her hand, and she counted the hides already down in the ooze, and she counted the hides drawn up and drip-drying on the racks, and she counted the hides still waiting green on the beam, and she wrote the tally in a small ledger she kept dry against her body inside her coat. She did not look up at the line. She had learned a long while ago not to look up at people who were looking at her, because looking up cost her something and gave her nothing back, and she was a woman who had learned to the penny what a thing cost. Her name was Della Roan, and the ground she was standing on, all 40 acres of it, she had bought for $55. Remember that. $55 at the courthouse door on a bright cold Tuesday, in front of the whole town, 4 years earlier to the week. They had laughed at her that day in the street. Not cruelly, and that was the part she would carry longest, that it had not been cruel. They had laughed the soft, sorry, sideways way that decent people laugh at a young widow who has just handed over every dollar she owns in the world for a piece of drowned bottom, grown up so rank in elder that a grown man could not walk 20 feet into it without a bush hook, and they had shaken their heads, and the kindest of them had been the hardest to bear, because the kindest of them had pitied her, and pity is a heavier load to carry up a hill than scorn ever was. What none of them knew that day, and what she herself did not know either, standing there with the auctioneer's receipt already folded once in her cold hand, was that under the elder, under 40 winters of leaf fall and root and black rot, in one straight buried row along the old mill race, 7 stone vats were lying in the ground, and had been lying there the whole time, patient, full of dark water and dead leaves, waiting the way a thing waits that was never told how to stop waiting. The line at the gate did not know it yet either. Not really. Not the meaning of it. Even as they stood on the very ground and smelled the bark and the lime and watched her count. They knew only that their hides were rotting on their barn floors, and there was not a working tannery left within 50 miles of them, and no leather to be had at any price, and that this woman, this drowned bottom woman they had pitied, could take the ruined skin off a dead animal and give it back to them as harness and boot leather and sole, and that she was the only one left in all that country who could. So they stood in the cold with their hats in their hands and waited to be counted, and up on the hill in the last of the dark the goats went on eating, and the bells went on, and I will tell you how it came to be, all of it, from the beginning, because a thing like this is not told by starting at the end. It only starts there. Go back then, and understand first what lay under that bottom, because the whole of it turns on the 7 vats, and on the fact that for the better part of a man's lifetime, not one living soul in the county so much as remembered they were there. They had belonged to a tannery. Everyone would have told you that much, if you had thought to ask, though almost no one thought to ask anymore, and those who did could only tell you that there had been a tan yard down on Pell Creek in their grandfather's time, and that it had failed and been swallowed and was worthless bottom now, fit for nothing, a place a boy might get snake bit. That was the whole of the town's memory of it. But under the elder the yard was still there, laid out exactly as the men who built it had laid it out. 7 pits dug and lined and mortared with cut stone, hauled up from the creek by ox and sledge, sunk in a row along the race so the water could be run into them, and drawn off again. And each one had held its own stage of the work. The lime pits at the head where the hair was raised off the green hides, and the handler pits in the middle where the leather took its first color, and the deep layaway pits at the foot where a hide might lie down under bark and liquor for the better part of a year and come up leather, slow, the way the trade was done before the world got in a hurry. The stone did not rot. That is the thing to hold in your mind through all the rest of it. Wood rots and iron rusts, and a man's name goes out of the town's mouth inside 2 generations, but cut stone set below the frost line and kept wet does not go anywhere. It only gets covered. The vats had filled with black leaves and rain and the fine washed silt of 40 floods, and the elder had grown up over them and closed above them like water closing over a drop stone, and grass and then brush, and then the tall rank elder had made a roof over the whole work so dense that you could stand on the very lip of the deepest pit and never know the ground was hollow under your boot. The town looked at that bottom and saw a briar patch. It was a tannery with a roof of leaves, and it was waiting, and it did not know it was waiting, and neither did she, and that is where the story truly sits, in that gap between what a thing is and what a whole town has agreed that it is, which are almost never the same, and the distance between them is the only room a person like Delarone ever gets to stand in. Now step back with me, all the way back to the year the fever came. That is the ritual I keep, to say it plainly and step back, and I will not step forward again until it is done. The year the fever came, Delarone was 22 years old, and she had a husband named Thomas, and a rented 2-room house at the edge of town, and almost nothing else, and by the time the leaves turned, she had no husband, and she had the almost nothing, and she had his debts on top of it. Let me set out what she owned, exactly, because a person is their inventory before they are anything else, and the town read her by hers and read her wrong. She owned 1 iron cookpot and 1 skillet, both of them hers before the marriage. She owned a bed and a table and 2 chairs and a 3rd chair that Thomas had been mending when he took sick, and it stood by the door for a year with the seat half caned because she could not bring herself to finish it and could not bear to throw it out. She owned a good wool coat, a man's coat, his, that she took in at the shoulders and wore. She owned 9 goats. The goats were the whole of it. The goats were what Thomas had left her that had breath in it. A rough scrub herd he had taken in trade for a debt a year before he died, and that everyone had told him was a fool's trade. 9 goats and no land to run them on. And after he was gone, she milked them and made a hard white cheese and sold it door to door. And she owed $11 at the store that she paid down $1 and sometimes 50 cents at a time. And she owed the rent, and she owed the doctor who had not saved him. And the town watched her go by with her cheese basket on her arm, and her chin held level, and they said among themselves, the kindest of them, that it was a shame, and a pity, and that something ought to be done for her, and that she could not go on. They had decided it among themselves the way a town decides the weather. She could not go on. And she heard it, because she heard everything, and she said nothing back to it, not that day nor any day. And she went home, and she counted her goats, which had become the thing she did with her hands when the inside of her wanted to come apart. She counted them, 9, and milked them, and wrote down in a scrapbook how much each one gave, and paid her $1 at the store, and went on. That was the first thing about her the town could not see and did not think to count. She went on, and she watched, and she remembered, and she wrote it down. They pitied her, and I want to be plain about the pity, because the pity was the whole of their verdict, and the pity was the worst of it. Scorn a person can lean into. Scorn gives you something to push against, and a proud person has been known to build a whole life on the pushing. But pity takes the ground out from under a person, because pity has already decided the ending, and the ending it has decided is that you are a thing that happened, a sad thing, a thing to be shaken over. And once a town has settled that you are a sad thing, there is nothing you can do inside their eyes to become anything else, because every step you take they read as the sad struggle of a sad thing, and even your walking is pitiful to them. The women brought her food she had not asked for and did not need, brought it in a way that let them feel the warmth of the bringing, and she took it and thanked them because refusing it would have cost her more than the small humiliation of the taking, and they went home lighter, and she stood in her door with the covered dish and her face did not move. That was the second thing they could not see. Behind the face she was not falling. Behind the face she was keeping accounts. She knew to the ounce what her goats gave, and to the penny what she owed, and to the day how long the money would last. And she carried the whole ledger of her life behind a still face. And a person who can do that, who can hold the count steady while the world calls her a ruin, is not a ruin. She is a bank that has not opened yet, but you cannot see a bank that has not opened. You can only see a young widow with a cheese basket, and pity her, and be wrong. The land they would have sold her, the drowned bottom on Pell Creek, had its own long dying, and it is worth the telling, because the town's certainty about that ground was built up as patiently and as wrongly as its certainty about her. There had been a real tannery there once, and a real man who built it, Elias Pell, and in his day the yard on the creek had been the making of the town, or half of it. Pell had come into that country when it was still mostly timber, and the timber was the point, because the old way of tanning ran on bark, on the tannin cooked out of oak and hemlock and chestnut, and Pell had a whole mountainside of it above a creek with a steady fall of water, and he cut the bark and ground it at a bark mill, and ran the water into his stone pits and took in the hides of every farm for 2 counties, and he made harness leather and sole leather and belting, and the town grew up around the smell of it, because a tannery stinks and a stink can be the smell of money. Pell prospered. He built the 7 vats to last 100 years, and he built his house above them, and his wife, wanting no part of the reek in her dooryard, set a hedge of elder along the mill race to screen the yard and hold the bank, and the elder took to that wet ground the way fire takes to dry grass, and that hedge is the mother of every stalk of elder that ever covered the place, so that when people in later years cursed the elder they were cursing a woman's tidy hedge gone a lifetime feral, though not one of them knew it. Then the bark gave out, the way it always did, because the old tanning ate the forest to make the leather, and the hemlock above the creek was cut to the last stick, and about the same time the railroad came through the low country 40 miles off, and brought cheap city leather tanned quick, with acids and chemicals that no barkyard could match on price, and the harness trade that had walked to Pell's door began to ride past it on the cars. Pell held on longer than sense, because a man will, and then a spring flood took out the dam and the head of water that ran his pits, and Pell was old by then, and had no heart to rebuild it, and he died the next winter, and his sons had already gone to the low country to work for wages, and the yard stood empty. And the elder came down off the race and into the yard, over the pits, up the banks, and in 10 years you could not find the bark mill, and in 20 you could not find the vats, and the county sold the 40 acres for the back taxes, and no one bid, and it went to the county, and sat, and the county tried across the years to be shut of it and could not. They tried to make it into a farm, and the men who tried came away beaten, because the bottom was too wet and too shaded to break, and the elder they grubbed out one year was back thicker the next, from the roots they could not get. For elder does not die when you cut it. It answers a cutting with 3 stems where there was 1. They tried fire in a dry autumn and burned the tops off and thought they had it, and by June the black ground was green again, hip high, because fire is only a hard pruning to a thing like that. A man ran cattle in there one season to eat it down, and the cattle would not touch the elder, cattle being grazers and not browsers, and 2 of his steers bogged to the belly in the soft ground over the old pits, and had to be dragged out with chains, and he took his cattle home and told the town what he thought of Pell's bottom, and after that no one tried anything at all. It was worthless. Everyone knew it was worthless. It had a lineage of worthlessness a lifetime long, a whole history of good men defeated by it, and that history was itself the proof, because in that country the surest way to know a thing could not be done was that better men than you had already failed to do it. So when the county at last put the 40 acres up again at the courthouse door for whatever it would bring, the town came to watch the way you come to watch a thing you already know the end of, and the one person there who did not know the end of it was the young widow with her chin held level, standing at the back with $55 in a knotted handkerchief, which was every cent she had in the world, and $11 more than she had, because she had borrowed the 11, and she meant to buy the elder, and she alone in that whole crowd had understood something the rest could not, which was not what was in the ground, for she did not know that yet, but only what was on top of it. She had watched the goats, that was the whole of her secret, and it was not a secret, it was standing in plain sight in her own pen, only no one had thought to read it. She had watched her 9 scrub goats for 2 years, and she had seen what they were, which was not what the town thought a goat was. The town thought a goat was a poor woman's cow, a thing that gave a little milk and got into the garden. Della had watched them eat. She had watched them walk past good grass to strip the leaves off a briar, watched them stand on their hind legs to pull down a sapling and eat the bark clean off it in a ring so that the sapling died, watched them clear the fence line of every green woody thing she turned them onto, patient and steady and endless. Because a goat is not a grazer that eats the ground. A goat is a browser that eats the brush, and it will eat, by choice, the very things a plow and a fire and a herd of cattle cannot master. She had watched her goats kill brush that men could not kill. And she had stood at the back of that crowd and looked at 40 acres of elder that had beaten every man who ever raised a hand against it, and she had thought, in the plain arithmetic that was the whole shape of her mind, that the town had brought the wrong animal to the fight every time, and that she had the right one, and that no one else could see it, because no one else had spent 2 years watching a goat eat. The auctioneer opened it at any figure, at $1, as a joke, and the crowd laughed, and then there was the long silence of a thing no one wants. And into that silence, from the back, in her plain, steady voice, the voice she had spent years learning so that it would not shake in front of them, Della Roan said $55, the whole of it at once, more than anyone would have gone in a week of dollar bids, and the silence changed its shape. Then the laughing started, softer than before and worse than before, and a man near the front turned around to look at her the way you look at a person who has hurt themselves, and the auctioneer asked her twice if she was sure, kindly, which was its own small knife, and she did not answer the second time, because she had answered once, and a thing said once is said. She walked up through the crowd that parted for her the way a crowd parts for the sick, and she paid the $55 out of the knotted handkerchief onto the table, counting it, and she took the receipt, and she folded it once, the way a person folds a thing they mean to keep, and she walked out with her chin level and did not look at one face, and behind her, the town let out its breath and shook its heads and said among themselves that the poor thing had lost what little sense grief had left her, and that now she truly could not go on. There was an old man at the edge of the crowd who did not laugh. He was called Absalom, old Absalom, and he was one of those men a town keeps at its edge without ever deciding to. Too old and too poor and too much from somewhere else to be reckoned with. A man who lived alone up a hollow and dressed deerskins and goatskins by hand in the old way, and sold them soft and sold buckskin gloves, and did it as his people had done it, and had done it his whole long life on the worst leavings of the trade. A hide at a time, with lime he burned himself and bark he peeled himself, poor as the ground. He had been a boy at Pell's yard. He was the last man alive who had stood in that tannery when it ran, who had carried bark and turned hides in those very pits, and he had watched the town forget the whole trade around him across 50 years the way you watch a tide go out, and say nothing, because no one had ever once asked him what he knew. He watched the widow pay her $55 for the elder bottom, and he did not laugh, and when she came out through the crowd he fell in beside her on the road, an old poor man and a young poor woman, the two the town had already written off, walking out of town together, and he spoke to her. He spoke as though the words cost him money, which is how a man talks who has never in his life had enough of anything. He told her he had known the man who dug what she had bought. He told her there was more down under that brush than she had paid for, and more than the county had ever known it was selling, and that she would find it if she lived long enough and worked hard enough and had the patience of the dead. And she asked him what, and he did not answer that. Not yet, because he was a man who understood that a thing shown is worth less than a thing found. Instead, he stopped in the road and he bent down, old as he was, slow, and he pressed the flat of his hand to the dirt of the wagon track, laid his whole palm flat against the ground, the way another man might lay a hand on the shoulder of a son, and he said the thing to her that she would carry the rest of her life, and say again with her own hand flat on the ground, when she was as old as he was, and he was 50 years in it. He said, "A thing grown over is not a thing gone, and the ground keeps a trade long after the town has agreed to forget it." Then he stood up, his hands still dusted with the road, and he told her the one thing that was of any use to her that day, which was that if she meant to fight the elder, she should bring goats and not men. And she told him she had 9, and for the first time something moved in the old man's face, and he said that 9 was a beginning, and he walked up his hollow, and she walked to her drowned 40 acres to begin, and that was the day it started, though nothing on that ground looked 1 inch different for a year. Now understand the method, because the method is the whole of it and a lazy telling would skip it, and I will not skip it, for if you do not believe the method, you cannot believe the ending. And the method is a true one that a doubting man could stand and watch and be made to admit. Goat's browse. That is the engine of the entire thing, and it is not magic, it is appetite pointed like a tool. A goat left to itself will drift and pick and take a leaf here and a leaf there and do a bottom no lasting harm in a year. But a goat penned tight on a small patch, forced to it, with nothing else to eat, will strip that patch to the wood and then gnaw the wood. And Della had watched enough to know it, and she built her method on it out of nothing but hurdles and patience and the animals she had. She could not fence 40 acres. She fenced a half acre, She made light hurdles of split poles she cut and lashed herself, movable fence, and she penned her 9 goats hard onto a half-acre of the worst elder, and she left them there with water and no way out and nothing to eat but the elder, and they ate it. They ate the leaves first, standing on their hind legs to reach, and then they stripped the bark off the green stems in rings, girdling them, and a girdled elder stem dies from the ring up, and then in their boredom and their hunger, they gnawed the low sprouts to the ground, and in 3 weeks, that half-acre that had beaten grown men with axes and fire looked like a place a hard hand had passed over, and the ground showed through black and open to the sky for the first time in 40 years. Then she moved the hurdles and did the next half-acre, and that was the work, and there was no other trick to it, only that, done over and over across a bottom so big that when she finished the last half-acre nearest the creek, the first half-acre up the hill had thrown its sprouts again and had to be done twice, because elder answers a cutting with 3 stems, but it cannot answer being eaten to the root over and over, season on season, for a browsing goat does not prune a thing, it starves it. It takes the leaf that feeds the root, before the root can store against winter, and a stool of elder gnawed bare, every time it dares to green will at last, in the 3rd year or the 4th, give up and die down to the crown and rot, and the ground it held is opened, and that is a slow, sure, dull, unglamorous killing that no man with an axe can match, because a man gets tired and goes in at dark and the goat does not. The goat is at it again at first light, patient and endless, and without any feeling about it at all, turning the worthless thing into open ground 1 mouthful at a time. She measured it in seasons because there was no faster clock for it. By the first winter she had cleared perhaps 4 acres, and it did not look like 4 acres, it looked like a war a person was losing. She wintered the goats on the browse she had cut and dried and on the town's pity, which she still could not refuse and still took with a level face. And in the spring she had 11 goats where she had had 9, because goats breed, and she wrote the 2 new ones in her book, and she went back at the elder. By the 2nd autumn she had a herd of 19, and near half the bottom showing ground. And the town had begun to notice, not with respect, for they had no respect to give a thing they had already ruled on, but with a new and sharper edge to the pity, because a widow who buys a briar patch is a sad story that ends, and a widow who is slowly, visibly, with her own 2 hands and a string of goats, clearing a bottom that beat every man before her, is a sad story that will not end the way they have filed it, and people do not like a story that will not stay filed. They began to watch her the way you watch weather, that is deciding whether to turn bad. It was in the grind years that the girl came. Her name was Junie Tell, and she was 9 years old and thin the way children got thin in that country in a hard year. And her father had been a harness maker in the town, who had gone broke and sick together when the cheap city leather killed his trade, and had died of it in a manner of speaking, and her mother took in washing, and there were younger ones. And Junie came out to the Rhone bottom in the 2nd summer because someone had told her the goat woman sold milk cheap, and she came for milk and she stayed for work, drifting out day after day to hold the hurdles and drive the goats and sit at the edge of the cleared ground grave and quiet as a small old woman. And Della, who had no child and had stopped letting herself want one, taught her without meaning to teach her, taught her the count. She showed the girl how to write down each goat and its milk and each half-acre and the day it was cleared and the day it greened again and had to be done twice, and the girl took to the counting the way Della had taken to it, because the girl too had learned young that the world would not hold still for you, and that the one power a powerless person has is to keep the record straight, to know exactly what is, when everyone around you is telling you a comfortable story about what is. Junie kept the ledger after that. It became her task and her pride, and she was grave about it beyond her years. And I tell you about her now, small and thin at the edge of the cleared ground with the book on her knees, so that you will have her in your eye later, because the knowledge Della was building was going to have to outlive Della, and it was going to live in Junie Tell. It was in the 4th spring that the ground gave up the first stone. The goats had eaten a stubborn wet half-acre down along the old race to the black dirt, and the spring rains had washed the black dirt, and Junie, driving the goats off it at evening, put her bare foot down on something that was not ground, something flat and hard and square-edged under the mud, and she scraped it with her heel and called to Della, and Della came, and the 2 of them knelt down in the wet and dug at it with their hands, and it was cut stone, dressed stone, the squared and mortared lip of a pit, laid there by men who had been dead longer than either of them had been alive. Della cleared the mud along it with her hands, one careful foot and then another, and the line of it ran straight and true, and did not stop, and she followed it, and it turned a corner it had been built to turn, and she sat back on her heels in the mud with her hands black to the wrist, and she understood the old man's words with her whole body all at once. A thing grown over is not a thing gone, and she did not say anything, and Junie asked her what it was, and Della said only, lo, that it was what they had bought. Then she got up and got a spade. They found the second vat that week and the third before the leaves were full, and Della went up the hollow to the old man, and she brought him down to the bottom and stood him at the edge of the cleared ground and let him look. And old Absalom looked a long time at the row of stone lips coming up out of the mud along the race where he had carried bark as a boy. And his mouth worked, and he did not say the grand thing you might expect a man to say. He said only, quietly, that there would be 7, that Pell had built 7, and he walked the line with his stick and counted them off in the ground the goats had cleared. 1, 2, 3, and pointed his stick at where the others would lie still under the last of the brush. And he was right. There were 7, and by that autumn the goats had bared the ground to the last of them, and Della Roan stood at the head of a row of 7 stone tannery vats on land she had bought for $55. And she knew, because the old man had begun to teach her, exactly what they were for. That is when the man in the good coat came, because that is always when he comes. He does not come for a briar patch. He comes when the value has stood up out of the ground where anyone can see it, and not one day before. His name was Harlan Sedge, and he was a leather factor and a dealer in claims from the county seat. A smooth, unhurried, well-fed man who wore gray gloves and carried a flat leather folder of papers under his arm. And he drove out to the roan bottom on a good horse in the 4th autumn, as though he were doing a kindness by coming, and in a way that is exactly what he believed he was doing. He walked the yard with Della and admired the vats, and he admired the goats, and he admired her, and he called her industry a wonder, and he grieved, gently, with real gentleness in his voice, that a woman alone should have to shoulder such a load. And then he opened his flat folder and showed her his kindness, which was paper. He had a survey. He had an old lease. He explained, and he was a man who loved to explain, that the strip of ground the vats stood on, the narrow reserve along the mill race, had never rightly passed with the farm in the old county sale, that it had been held out under a lease to the original tanning concern, whose successor interest, by a chain of assignments he had the papers for right there, he now held, and that therefore the vats, so to speak, the working of them, the trade of them, were his, or would be his, the moment it went before a judge, and that he would hate above all things to see her put through the cost and the shame of a suit she could not win. A young woman, alone, against a chain of clear title, and so he had come, out of nothing but regard for her, to make it simple. He would buy her interest out. He named a figure, cash, more money than she had ever held, and he laid it in front of her as a mercy, and he warned her, softly, folding his gloved hands, that ruin was the only other road, and that he would sleep poorly knowing he had not warned her. And he sat back to let the kindness and the fear do their work, the way they always had for him, because Harlan Sedge had taken a dozen places off a dozen tired people with that same soft speech and had never once had to raise his voice. He talked a long while. That was his nature, and it was his flaw, though he did not know it was a flaw, for talking had always been the tool that worked, and a man does not examine the tool that works. He told her all about the survey and the assignments and the law and his own good heart, and somewhere in the long, warm middle of all that talking, easy, in passing, as a man does who is sure he is the only one in the room who truly knows the ground, he said that a working tannery, 7 good vats like these, was a rare and valuable thing and not to be wasted on a woman who could not know their worth. 7. She heard it. She had said not 4 words the whole time he talked. She had stood with her hands still, and her face still, and let him spend himself, and now she heard the number come out of his mouth. 7 vats, and she went quiet in a different way than she had been quiet before, because the ground had only been bared to the 7th vat that very spring. The 7th lay farthest down toward the creek under the last of the brush and had come clear only months before, and no one had counted it but herself and Junie and the old man. No one. And the town below still spoke, when it spoke of the place at all, of the old tan yard, vaguely, as a ruin, and had no notion whether it held 2 pits or 20. There was no way on this earth for Harlan Sedge to know there were 7 vats from any paper in any folder. Because no paper said it, only the ground said it, and the ground had only just finished saying it. He knew because he had been out there. He knew because he had walked that bottom, or sent a man to walk it, and counted, quietly. Some morning she was up the hill, the way a man counts a thing he means to take. He had been watching her clear it. He had been waiting, all along, for the goats to finish the digging so that he could arrive with his gloves and his folder the day the treasure stood up out of the mud. And his knowing the number was the whole confession of it, that the thing had never been worthless, that he had seen the worth before he made his kind offer, that the kindness was a coat over a theft. She said almost nothing. She let the silence sit until it was uncomfortable, which cost her nothing, and cost him a great deal, and then she said only that he had counted them too. That was all. She did not raise her voice, and she did not accuse him. She said it flat and quiet, that he had counted them too, and she watched it land in his face, watched him understand that she had understood, and then she did the thing that finished it. The thing that had been ready in her coat for 4 years without her ever knowing this was the day it was for. She took out the receipt, the auctioneer's receipt for the 40 acres, folded once, and kept dry against her body since the courthouse door, $55, and folded inside it, in her own hand, was the description of the parcel, as the county clerk had read it aloud that Tuesday, from the old patent book, every word of it, because she had stood at the courthouse the week after the sale and asked the clerk to read her the full description again, and she had copied it down word for word the way she copied down everything, because keeping the record straight was the one power she had, and the old patent, the first grant, the deepest paper there was, described the parcel plainly as the Pell Tan Yard lot. And named in it, in the surveyor's own dead hand a lifetime ago, the tan yard and the 7 stone vats thereon, as part and parcel of the 40 acres, conveyed and reconveyed, and sold at last for taxes entire, vats and all, to whoever stood at the courthouse door with the money, which had been her, for $55, 4 years before. His lease was on the adjoining lot. She had read it upside down across the table while he talked, the way she read everything, and she had already seen the number of it, and the number was not her number, and his whole chain of kind assignments ran back to a different lot along the same race. The mill lot, not the tan yard lot, and it had never touched her 7 vats at all, and the only way he could have believed his paper reached them was if he had walked her ground and seen the vats and decided to reach for them, and his own tongue had already told her he had walked it. She laid the receipt and the copied description on the table in front of him, side by side with his folder, and she put one finger on the words 7 stone vats thereon, and she said nothing more, because a thing shown plainly does not need saying. He read it. He was not a stupid man, only a certain one, and it takes a certain man a long moment to stop being certain. He read it twice, and the warmth went out of his face by degrees, not all at once, and he gathered his papers back into the flat folder with hands that had lost their ease, and he made one last soft speech about how there had plainly been a misunderstanding, and how glad he was it was cleared up. And she let him make it, and he put on his gray gloves and rode back the way he had come, and he did not come again, and that was the whole of the war, and no one had raised a hand or a voice, and she had won it 4 years before it started, at the clerk's counter, with a stub of pencil, by keeping the record straight when there was nothing yet to keep it about. It was the 5th winter that turned the town, and it turned hard, the way that country turned when it turned, a winter that came early and lay long, that froze the creeks to the stones, and buried the fence lines, and killed stock in the barns and the draws by the hundred, so that when the thaw finally came at last, it came over a country littered with the dead, cattle and horses and mules gone down in the cold, and every farm for 50 miles had hides, green hides, the last wealth of a dead animal, the one thing a hard winter leaves you, and not a soul in all that ruined country had any way on earth to turn a hide into leather, because the trade was gone, because the tanneries had failed a generation back the same as Pell's had failed, and the cheap city leather that had killed them all came up the cars from the low country, and now the low country was hard hit too, and the cars were not running, and the price of a piece of harness leather had gone to the moon, and there was none to be had at any price. And a farmer with a barn full of green hides and a broken harness and no leather to mend it is a man watching his last wealth rot on the floor. because a green hide left green does not keep. It slips and stinks and is gone in a week. Worth nothing. Worse than nothing. And there was one working tannery left in all that country. 7 stone vats along a mill race on a bottom a young widow had bought for $55, cleared by goats, dug out of the mud, relined and relimed and rebarked across a year, by that widow and a grave girl, and an old man who remembered the trade, the lime pits burning again, and the bark ground again at a mill Absalom had shown her how to rig off the mended race, the whole old slow patient works alive again, exactly where the town had agreed it was dead. The mocked thing was the only thing that could save the mockers. The drowned bottom nobody would cross the creek for held the one trade the whole ruined county suddenly could not live without, and the pity turned around in a single season and became need, which is a harder and a truer thing than respect, and the town that had shaken its head at her came down the wagon track along Pell Creek with its hats in its hands and its hides on its backs to ask the goat woman to save its winter, and stood in a line at her gate to be counted. Now watch what she did with them, because this is the part that was the win. And it was not the vats, and it was not the money. She could have skinned them. She held the only tannery for 50 miles in a year, when leather was worth its weight in silver, and every man in the line was desperate. And she could have named any price she liked, and they would have paid it and been grateful. And a smaller soul would have, and no one on earth could have blamed her. They who had pitied her and laughed at her $55 in the street. She did not skin them. Neither did she play the saint and give it away, because she was no fool, and she had paid in 4 years of mud and cold and pity for what she held, and she knew to the penny what a thing was worth. And a person who lets themselves be robbed by their own goodness has only changed which fool is at the table. She set a fair price, a true one, not a low one, and she said as much, plainly, a fair price for honest work, shares of the leather for those who had it to trade, and cash for those who had cash. And then she did the thing that was the whole of her, the thing the old man had put in her without either of them naming it. For the ones who had nothing, the ones the winter had stripped to the bone, the ones who stood in her line with a hide and empty pockets, and the particular shame of a proud person come to beg, she took their hides and tanned them on a handshake, on credit, on her book, to be paid when the leather had made them whole again, a season, a year, whenever, and she wrote each one down in Junie's ledger, in Junie's careful hand, not as a debt to hang over a man, but as a record kept straight, because keeping the record straight was the only religion she had, and she trusted them, which was the gift, not the leather, the trust, the being counted at last as a person who would pay, and not as a charity that had failed. And the men who came to her gate, bent with shame, walked back up the track with their hides on her book, and their backs straight, and that was the thing she gave them that was worth more than leather. So come back now to where we started, in the last dark of a winter morning 4 years and more from the courthouse door, and stand again at the gate. The line runs down the wagon track along Pell Creek to the ford, and the same people are in it who laughed in the street, and they have their hats in their hands, and every withheld thing has come round to its answer. The 7 vats you could not understand are 7 stone pits that a dead man named Pell dug and the elder buried and 40 goats uncovered. And they are full of dark liquor and working hides, and they are hers, bought entire for $55, proved hers by her own straight record against a smooth man's paper. The crowd you saw waiting with its hats off is the town that pitied her, come to be saved by the thing it pitied her for buying, and the small ordinary act you saw her doing, the counting, the tally in the ledger against her body, is the whole of who she always was and the thing they could never see, the watching and the counting and the keeping of the record, the trait that was worth more than the land, doing now in the open what it had always done in the dark. And up on the hill in the graying light the goats go on, 40 of them now where there were 9, 1 goat, near enough, for every acre they ate down to the stone, their bells small and dull and steady over the bottom, still eating, because that is the only thing they were ever for, and the only thing they know how to stop doing is never. And let me close the accounts, every one of them, the way she closed hers, keeping them all straight. Old Absalom lived to see it, which was the thing she had wanted most, that he should live to see the yard run again in his lifetime after 50 years of watching the town forget it around him. And she paid him first and paid him well and paid him always. A share of every hide and a warm, dry room at the head of the yard, and tobacco and boots, and the one thing worth more than any of it, which was to be asked, daily, what he knew. so that the last man who had carried bark at Pell's yard as a boy spent his last years the master of it again, teaching the lime and the bark and the seasons to the widow and the girl. And he aged out slow and content by the fire, with a skin across his knee that he dressed by hand out of long habit. And when he went full, and she buried him above the vats where he had asked to lie, and she kept his grave. And Junie Tell grew up. She grew up grave and straight, with a ledger always somewhere on her, and she learned the whole of the trade from the old man before he went, and the whole of the keeping from Della. And she came into her woman's years standing at the head of the beam, in the yard she had helped dig out of the mud, as a thin, hungry child, running the count, running the work, so that the knowledge had made its jump, and would not die when Della died, which is the only kind of winning that lasts, the kind that outlives the winner. And Harlan Sedge was seen once more at the county seat in his gray gloves, thinner in the trade, and then was not seen, having gone off to some other county to be certain at some other tired person, his flat folder full of paper that had met, once, a woman with a better paper kept straighter, and had lost. And he left no mark on the place at all except the lesson of himself, that the man in the good coat comes only when the value stands up out of the ground, and that his coming is the surest proof there ever was that the thing was never worthless. And the town paid its book. Nearly every hide came right in the end. The credit paid off across the seasons in coin and work and shares, and the few that never paid she never chased, and counted them, and let them stand, because a record kept straight is not the same as a debt collected, and she knew the difference to the bone. And the town that had pitied her did not, in the way of towns, ever quite say it was sorry, but it took its hat off to her every time she passed for the rest of her life, which is the nearest a town ever comes, and it told her story to its children with the numbers in it, the $55 and the 40 acres, and the 9 goats and the 7 vats, the way you tell a thing you want badly to have believed from the start. And Della Roan grew old on the bottom and kept a strip of the elder standing along the race, tended, on purpose, both to screen the yard the way Pell's wife had meant it to, and to feed a few goats, so that the thing she had spent her youth killing, she kept a little of in the end, out of respect, the way you keep a little of any old enemy that taught you what you are. She grew old rich in the only ways that hold, and she never once gloated, not that day at the courthouse nor any day after, because gloating is a thing you do when you were surprised to win. And she had not been surprised, she had only been patient, and patience does not gloat, it just goes on. She was very old the last time the story has her in it, sitting in the sun at the head of the yard with the vats working below her under Junie's hand, when a young stranger came up the wagon track, a girl, thin, in a coat too big for her, with the look on her that Della knew from the inside because she had worn it herself once at that gate, the look of a person the world has already finished deciding about. And the girl had heard there might be work, and stood there ashamed to be asking. And Della Roan got up off her chair, old as she was, slow, the way the old man had once gotten down slow in the road, and she went to the girl and she bent, and she pressed the flat of her hand to the dirt of the yard, laid her whole palm flat against the ground exactly as he had laid his 50 years before, and she looked up at the girl and said to her the old man's words, unchanged, the words she had carried the whole way from the courthouse door. A thing grown over is not a thing gone, and the ground keeps a trade long after the town has agreed to forget it. And she straightened up with the yard dust on her palm and put the girl to work, and up on the hill the goats went on, and their bells came down through the standing elder along the race, small and dull and steady, going on into the light and not stopping, and going on and going on.